Ipswich Town were never supposed to be built for such riches, a league title, European tours and the FA Cup as they furnished the nation with their two most beloved managers. What came after was a relentless collapse.
The victory condemned Ipswich Town to relegation along with Birmingham City and West Bromwich Albion.
Alf Ramsey had taken Ipswich Town to the top of English football and almost beyond that via the means of the European Cup. There wasn't supposed to be a sequel. Then Bobby Robson turned up, arguably outperformed his predecessor as Ipswich succeeded in the FA Cup and UEFA Cup, despite English football becoming more of a closed shop. They were both captured by England, leading the Three Lions to rarely seen heights as World Cup contenders. Ipswich Town meanwhile were left to the dirt, left wondering at the stars, and they hardly helped themselves. Just 9 days before the start of the 1982-83 season, they selected their Robson replacement, Bobby Ferguson. The only time Ipswich had finished outside the top six in the prior decade, they had won the FA Cup. It's an understatement to say that backs were against the wall. And that's before you delve deeper and wave goodbye to Arnold Muren at the end of his contract, with Mick Mills tardily in tow that November. At least Alan Brazil and Eric Gates were kept hold of, even if they did spend the majority of the season on the transfer list.
La vittoria più convincente è venuta sempre in Coppa UEFA dalla Roma, che ha battuto per 3-0 una squadra.
Here's a nice ball for McElroy, and there it is. Maguire, Paul Maguire, and the player who made it was definitely Chamberlain.
There was to be no fairy tale stint in Europe this time, as that Roma defeat proved, but the majority of the Ipswich faithful knew that already, even before they were handpicked one of the harder European ties in the eventual Italian champions. Less excusable was the visit of Stoke City and 5 winless in the league that preceded it. The season was arguably a free hit for Ferguson considering the legendary prowess he was trying to succeed, but there would be no forgiveness if they didn't rectify their position as bottom of the league and the only soul without a win all campaign.
The centre of Ipswich. And Sunray is there!
Only Ipswich could swear off a barren run by hitting 6 on the road in their first win of the season, give Roma the fright of their life in an ultimately futile second leg win before dispatching the team of their era, the eventual champions nonetheless, Liverpool. Now of course it goes without saying that Liverpool wouldn't wait for their revenge, dumping Ipswich out of the League Cup weeks later, whilst Ferguson's side wouldn't win again until 5 weeks later in the league. But when they did, they hit 6 again, this time at home to West Brom. This was a maddening form of Town back in full colour. They could go 5 in a row without a loss against some of the division's harder nuts to crack, but they could just as easily turn that season salvaging form into 3 defeats before New Year and against Norwich too. And speaking of the Canaries,
Ian, after Barham, a man that Ipswich are a little bit afraid of, tucks it in for Birchin, chance here for Norwich, Birchin scores!
whilst the cup heartbreak did push Ipswich on in an attempt to rectify the season, they won 6 of their remaining league games. Still inconsistent, just not as much as beforehand, and despite the 20-goal season from John Walk, Ipswich were 10 points from Europe. Another big block from the Titanic Bobby Robson team departed in the summer as Fran Tyson joined his compatriot in fleeing what was quickly becoming a sinking ship. Then out of nowhere, some form.
To set up Gates for a goal after 36 minutes. Clements again left exposed. But Spurs' unselfish Mariner made it 3-1 right on the final whistle.
Reality wasn't far around the corner. After all, Ipswich had failed to furnish the team with new talent, thanks largely due to the expensive erection known as the Pioneer Stand at £1.4 million. It didn't help that director and former chairman John Cobbold passed away aged only 56 midway through the 1983-84 season. Then there were the pay disputes involving John Walk and Paul Mariner, which ultimately left everyone involved rudderless. The players' plan backfired in the eyes of the supporters, then they both fled midway through the season anyway, to Liverpool and Arsenal respectively. Their departures could have been timed a little bit better.
Donowa on the far post, and Mick Channon doesn't miss them from there. That's Mick Channon, goal scorer.
Tried the shot. Oh, a magnificent
clever aloft chip which opened the scoring in the 40th minute.
Yeah, that's pretty much a snapshot of the season. Undone by local rivals again in the League Cup, downright humiliated in the FA Cup, before something of the pages of crap 80s football when Ipswich showed up at Kenilworth Road in the middle of a barren run and got dismantled. Their latest run amidst the departures of Walker Mariner stretched to 7 lost in a row, and it took them from an already poor 15th place to within the dreaded drop zone. It was only out of necessity that funds were made to sign West Brom's midfielder Romeo Zondervan and Leicester's goalkeeper Mark Grew, whilst reputations were risked on untested and inexperienced names in fullback Frank Yollop, youngster Mark Brennan and barely out of the womb Jason Dazelle. They were the unlikely sparks to a rejuvenation that started at Luton of all places, where a second league win was recorded. Thereafter, winning 5 of their last 6 inched them away from peril and into a safer place in the history books. After all, they only finished 3 places and 5 points worse off than the prior season, winning the same 15 out of 42 matches. The 84-85 campaign delivered a new look in a desperate hope that fortunes might change. Look at this shirt, and then look at this one. Do you see much difference? And then look at this run of results, and there, you will ultimately see the difference. Whilst France were conquering Europe with their iconic shirt, Ipswich ambled to their 5 fixtures in their new clobber without winning a game. It was only thanks to a defensive grit that 4 out of those 5 games were drawn. This would ultimately be that now spearheaded by Russell Osman and Terry Butcher that kept Town up. That's how far the bar had dropped.
Duncan obliged from the spot for the 9th time this season.
Sheedy, well played by him. Still Sheedy, chip right across.
And don't think I'm just cherry picking bad results here against strong teams like the eventual cup winners, eventual league winners and the reigning UEFA Cup champions. No, this was a run of 8 defeats from 9, the lonely victorious island that was a 2-0 win at Stoke, sat in the middle of a torrential ocean of defeat. There was one shining light, as rare as it was now, and it was funded, of course, by the Milk Board.
Also manufactured Ipswich's match winner for Romeo Zondervan midway through the second half. Ipswich go through, and deservedly so.
In the choppy seas of league form, the League Cup was the comforting raft as Ipswich drove through Derby, Newcastle and Oxford. In a fiery quarter-final replay, Mick de Vrij dumped QPR out so Ipswich Town could get a whiff of Wembley again. The competition's field had long opened up to the point that Ipswich, despite recent failings, could comfortably be touted as favourites. Chelsea had only just come up from the second tier, Sunderland were about to go down, and then there was Norwich City, and of course it had to be them. 1985 had been opened up with a 2-0 win over Norwich on New Year's Day. De Vrij repeated the trick in the first leg of the semi-final, scoring the only goal of a victorious evening. The excitement was palpable heading in to Carrow Road for the second leg. A draw would take Town to Wembley again. The milk had soured and now Ipswich had to front up to the reality that their place in the top flight of English football was threatened. On the evening their milk was snatched from them, Ipswich resided in the relegation zone alongside Luton Town and a record-breakingly bad Stoke City. But this was no time for a reality check because there was still the potential for a trophy. Alright, now was time for the reality check. 17 games to save their season, Ipswich was still housed within that bottom 3, now they sat 6 adrift, but with a massive 4 games in hand. The hangover to a whirlwind start to March continued through the league form for the remainder of the month. 2 points gained from 4 matches, hardly the ideal start to a rampage up the division. The gap was now 7 points, having used up 2 of those 4 games in hand. Then Easter kicked in. West Brom, Nottingham Forest and most delightfully of all, Norwich City all fell within 6 days. Suddenly those chocolate eggs tasted a little bit sweeter as Town zoomed up the division to the nosebleeds of 18th place, still with those 2 games in hand. They could even afford to slide back into an inconsistency of losses and wins in equal measure, as Ipswich effectively sent Sunderland down on May the 11th before making absolutely certain of their survival 3 days later with a point at home to Coventry. They breathed a sigh of another season completed. It quickly became apparent that they had used up 8 of their 9 lives. Experience fled Portman Road in the summer of '85. Eric Gates and George Burley left for Sunderland. Russell Osman joined Leicester. In one swift movement, Ipswich had their team gutted. There will be no prizes on offer for guessing what happened next.
Oh, and what a lovely little chip there towards Club to Bowyer, and goal number 3.
Hold on. Duncan again with the cross.
It's there! It's the fullback Slacker!
Milk gave Ipswich the protein to stomach those difficult league autumnal months as Town occupied the quarter-finals of the League Cup once again. It was the least they could do since they entered 1986 in the relegation zone, and the fact that they had faced such luminaries as Darlington, Grimsby and Swindon to reach the final 8. Waiting for them, there was a team they knew all about, the almighty Liverpool. Typically they swatted aside Town, leaving Bobby Ferguson's team with just survival to fight for. After bouncing between inconsistencies, they appeared to be in a similar position to 12 months prior, keeping the bottom 3 at arm's length despite a flurry of problems wrong with the club.
Shot! Lovely cross.
Naturally, one win from their last 8 would correct that. Town slid to defeat against Leicester, Villa and Everton, which subjected them to one of the club's most important recent fixtures at home to Oxford. This, the one game Ipswich chose to win, deploying some breathing room for Town, sitting 3 places and 5 points ahead of the drop. Surely now they were safe. 2 tricky away games left, their relegation rivals couldn't all win, and plus both Birmingham and West Brom were down already, and just what were the chances of Ipswich being the one team out of the 4 that went down? Coventry's extra game meant Ipswich were guaranteed to start the final day outside the drop zone, but whilst Leicester's defeat at Liverpool was expected, the League Cup champions Oxford pulled 3 points out of the bag against Everton in a seismic result that affected both top and bottom of the division. Oxford, with that sneaky little fuck known as a game in hand, held the Joker card. That game would be played 48 hours after everybody else had finished their season on May the 3rd. It remained straightforward for Ipswich, win at home to Sheffield Wednesday, who had nothing to play for, and it was likely this ordeal would be long forgotten. They wouldn't win, which could still be fine, but then the results rolled in from around the country. Coventry had beaten QPR, they were safe. Leicester had beaten Newcastle, and they were safe. Oxford were at home to Nottingham Forest, needing a win to not only secure their safety but eliminate Ipswich from the division, but they lost. It all came down to May Day. Ipswich Town's season over, but Oxford United still had one little oscillation. The visitors to the Manor Ground were Arsenal, wrapped up all cosy in 7th place with European aspirations temporarily not a thing. Ipswich had to hope those suddenly sedentary beasts could get themselves up for the game. Anything but an Oxford win would keep Ipswich up.
Dream start by Ray Houghton. The 3 and the celebrations begin.
Ipswich Town would not be playing First Division football for the first time since the 1960s. The chairman reassured the club that nobody would be sacked, yet the Pioneer stand still loomed over the club like the financial white elephant. Only now, entering the 86-87 season, the threat was a little more acute. Easing that strain was Terry Butcher's well-telegraphed departure to Rangers for a Scottish record $725k. It had get him some European football at least, and he was far too good for the second tier. Less forgiveness, however, would be handed down to Trevor Putney, who swapped Ipswich for Norwich. Typical to a Bobby Ferguson Ipswich Town team, the campaign began in plodding fashion. Atypical though was the rousing return to league form thanks to the fortress that was known as Portman Road. Goals were now no longer a problem thanks to the free scoring Kevin Wilson and John Dean, as Ipswich reached the top 3 by Christmas and hovered around the top 5 all season. Now their eventual slinking off into 5th place after winning only 2 of their final 10 fixtures would normally have called any hope for the season stone dead. However, 86-87 was the first campaign of the Football League playoffs. Only the league had yet to master the art of taking 4 teams from the same division and allowing them to play off for one spot in the top flight. So when Ipswich sunk into the lowest playoff spot, they would be paired off with the First Division's 19th place side, Charlton Athletic. Oh, it was going to be a long old road yet before Ipswich Town were back in the big time. 1987-88 was the season where a little bit of light was injected back into the game. Hooliganism was down, money was up, but hadn't been increased that much that the sport was no longer a level playing field. Over at Portman Road, however, only darkness. Bobby Ferguson was the first Ipswich Town manager to be sacked after failing to steer the club to promotion. His successor was gleaned from slim pickings, Chesterfield's John Duncan beating out Gillingham's Keith Peacock at the interview stage. Whilst this were going on, Town only hemorrhaged players as Kevin Wilson flocked to Chelsea and Paul Cooper left upon the expiration of his contract to Leicester. The new manager had gotten rave reviews from getting a lot from nothing in his time at Chesterfield. Good job then, because Ipswich had the princely sum of note. So he got to work scouring the market for bargains. Wigan's Dave Lowe, Derby's Graham Harvey, Reading's Ron Fearon were added before Neil Woods came in from Rangers, and the net was cast even wider to snap up non-leaguer Simon Milton and Andy Bernal from Jerez in Spain. Some worked, some didn't, but at the cost there could be virtually no argument. What did stay the same was the well-worn sloppy start to the season, followed by a minute uptick in form into the largely inconsistent as Town were shoddy away from home yet kept things tight on their own ground. There it was, you could almost taste it, the grinding down of expectations, the reduction of entertainment for just merely existing in a division, only saving yourselves for a once-in-a-lifetime cup push or a half-hearted attempt at going for the playoffs. Entering 1988, Ipswich were right there, in the mix, going under the radar. You could throw a blanket over the entire top half as they stealthed about in the shadows of the division. A shame then that 88 actually had to begin. Town found themselves dazed into distraction with Man United in the FA Cup going out at the first hurdle, as well as the Simod fucking Cup, all the while the bread and butter of their league form had gone mouldy.
Take the free kick. And it's a goal from Martin Keown.
5 lost on the spin, gone now was the chance of promotion via the playoffs. Sensing this, the club cut weight, Ian Cranson and Ian Atkins departing, and even though they would win 4 of their last 5 league games, gifting them the illusion of a steady season in 8th, to the history books, it was a rocky start to life for John Duncan's Ipswich Town. But 1988-89 was here, relax, there was always a chance of making a second or third good impression. And this time Ipswich made a good start to the season. Get this, 5 wins from their first 7 and not even a single defeat. Maybe this John Duncan fella was right. After all, he'd gone into a vicious spin cycle in the transfer market again. He'd even coaxed £300,000 from the club coffers for David Linnigan, whilst Craig Forrest made his debut on the opening day in net. Daly and Atkinson had long since been hitting the headlines for Town for some of his goal scoring, and this fresher Ipswich looked all set to be upwardly mobile. Their first defeat came at Crystal Palace, but quickly corrected itself 4 days later with a win at home to Man City. But then Oxford United pitched up, who else, and they were employed to stick the spanner in that season. That home defeat spurred on a run of 5 without a point as Ipswich's lofty position as league leaders was quickly frittered away. The injury record was becoming that much of a problem that Chris Kawomia was chucked in at the deep end. Thankfully he swam, providing impetus to attack, whilst Duncan couldn't help himself by adding another player, Dundee United's Ian Redford. By Christmas the bloom was again back off that rose, Ipswich skulked about in mid-table, closer to the drop than the top. Nothing another signing couldn't solve. Here's the first ever Soviet to play in English football, Sergei Baltasha. A strong defensive presence in a successful Dynamo Kyiv side, so typical of English football that John Duncan slapped him haphazardly in midfield, and the signing was ultimately worthless. The season proved a carbon copy of Duncan's first attempt, nowhere in the league, but spruced up synthetically by 8 of the club's 22 wins coming in March onwards. Not only that, but they dipped out of each and every cup competition at the same stage. There comes a time when a relegated club abandons the pretense of fighting back into the division where they came from and simply accepts being part of the furniture. The 1989-90 season was that for this version of Ipswich Town. They couldn't keep hold of Daly and Atkinson's potential for much longer, allowing Chris Kawomia to lead the line. Ipswich had strayed from their typically slow starts into a miniature crescendo of inconsistency and fully into the John Duncan ways. Again, they were nothing in the cups. This time their fast start was shrunk down to just 2 games before the inevitable collapse began, only for a bit of autumnal life to breeze through Portman Road.
Town's day. Lowe's wind-assisted corner. Jason Dezelle with a near-post touch. This time Neil Thompson took it and made no mistake. And Ipswich are now creeping up that table.
As you should know by now, it wouldn't last long. Despite dredging themselves from 17th all the way up to a playoff spot by the end of the year, the Vales soon slipped. Dramatically too, as Port Vale stuck 5 beyond Ipswich on New Year's Day. Town wouldn't win their first league game of 1990 until March the 10th. By then they regressed to the mean of mid-table. If they hadn't have been such an unexpected giant for nearly 20 years, this meek malaise wouldn't even be worth making a video about. They'd become boring. Town thought so too, so they got rid of John Duncan. John Lyall was only the 9th manager of Ipswich Town. It felt like a summer of the status quo, as the new man only added Mick McGivern from Chelsea into his coaching staff and signed only a number 2 goalkeeper in the form of Phil Parkes. This, after a slew of departures and 2 defeats to begin the season, set a record pace to the Portman pessimism. Soon enough though, they'd show some stomach for the fight.
Which have a corner.
It's gone in.
Long ball down the right wing to Milton. Flicks it over Keith Hill. Pulls it back to Stockwell.
Those 2 late fightbacks spurred Town on into their usual inconsistencies before the reality of just how fair weather they really were came into sharp focus by the end of the year. From within 2 points of the playoffs to begin November, Ipswich wouldn't win again in the league until January the 12th. That's a run bookended by 3 losses with 7 draws squeezed into the middle of it. Back to the grind of mid-table, John Lyall's first season in charge was saved by the tinkering in the transfer market, acquiring frontmen Steve Whitten from Sheffield Wednesday and Paul Goddard from Millwall. Hardly the names to hitch a promotion wagon to, but names that would stop the slide into the lower reaches of the table. In the end, Ipswich did just about enough to remain a forgetful 14th, the club's lowest position since 1966. Forgiveness was applied to the wound since it was Lyall's first campaign, but there needed to be shoots of recovery seen in 1991-92. After all, the Premier League was right around the corner and Ipswich needed to be attached to that runaway train.
Jason Dezelle surged forward to land the opening goal, and Chris Kawomia used his speed to set up Paul Goddard for Town's second. It count, assisted by a deflection. But 60 seconds later, Stockwell was guilty of sloppy defending. Stewart struck for Rovers. Boothroyd served up Rovers' second for Devon White, worth waiting for. White landing his second of the match.
It was hardly the start of a promotion vehicle, sauntering into a 3-0 lead only to spaff it all away in the last quarter of the game. A combination of a new chairman in John Kerr and little transfer activity did little to soothe the anxious Ipswich faithful. And although early autumn victories could be strung together to inflate the town's psyche, just as pertinent was another relentless campaign of drawing 5 on the bounce before 3 defeats in October and November. Fair weather Ipswich had come along far too early and they were in 9th, having played more than anyone else in the division. The club was due to post a record loss of £747,000 despite making almost exactly that through the sales of Brian Gale and David Hill. The club was in serious danger. A great time then for some form to kick in.
Minutes into the second half, a rising left foot drive from Simon Milton.
A little bit of light to their midfield, I suggest. This is Dezelle sliding it through for Kawomia. Oh, and it's 3-0. Closed down by Burns. Gets the cross in. Oh, and in off the post.
It went on and on and on. A January loss in Middlesbrough, a mere pit stop before Town won 6 on the spin through the remainder of the month, all of February and the beginning of March. Ipswich not only had an automatic promotion spot but had a game in hand to top the table. Any hint that they were slowing down thanks to 2 points from 3 fixtures quickly quashed.
Dezelle made it 2-0. The second goal just after half time. This time
11 points ahead of third with 5 games to play, it was only a matter of time before Ipswich's Premier League status was confirmed. Then the relegation threatened Sunderland stung them 3-0. Then no hope as Bristol City took all 3 points, and yet Town still occupied top spot. They were still just 1 win away from promotion. And whilst Grimsby pooped that particular party on April 21st, they only delayed the inevitable until the 25th at Oxford United of all places. With a point, Ipswich were up exactly 30 years to the day that they were confirmed as champions under Alf Ramsey. 6 long years away from the top flight had been made to look longer from the comparative riches that would be bestowed upon Town in the shiny new Premier League. It was the club's saviour financially, even allowing them to spunk a record $650k on Derby's Geraint Williams. And with enough momentum, Ipswich made themselves at home in the new league.
Teeing up Gavin Johnson for his second goal of the week. Gavin Johnson's pass. Stockwell arrives for his second goal.
Being the last club undefeated in the first edition of the Premier League sounds good, doesn't it? It was a mere euphemism for the litany of draws that helped shackle Ipswich to 7th place with only 2 wins from 8, whilst fierce rivals Norwich topped the league, having won 6 but lost 1. Shipping 4 at Oldham would be the first harsh taste of Premier League medicine for the new boys, but the old fair-weather Ipswich would not return.
And a Paul Goddard volley sent City home, wondering if their time will ever come. The Gench's back flip gave him his first goal for Ipswich, and possibly his last.
In fact, they even climbed the division. Tentatively, you have to admit, but they could still hear the ringing in their ears of the New Year fireworks, yet still be within touching distance of the pace setters. It would have been a boastful season too if those leaders weren't Norwich City. Whilst the Canaries would sing from their perch for the majority of the season, Ipswich's branch snapped from underneath them. What could have been a generational win over Manchester United at the end of January, which took Town to 4th spot, instead descended to nightmarish proportions. They were bequeathed 2 players from the Portuguese league, Vlado Bozinovski and Boncho Genchev, and instead of pushing them on a little bit further, Town collapsed to 2 wins from 16. All those years in Division 1 where they had inflated their own sense of achievement by winning the odd game in the latter part of the season. Now they were in the business of wedging a big old stick in the spoke of some fast European-bound wheels which crashed the club out into 16th. Nonetheless, Ipswich Town were back in the big time. They had stayed there and looked as though they belonged. You'll have to wait for the conclusion of this story until tomorrow though, but until then, have a go on either of these videos when Ipswich could lay claim to being one of the best teams in England.